All right, cool. So thank you so much to Zarie Locke for chatting with me today for the TDEV project. So Zarie works with Victory programs in Massachusetts, but I will let them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do.
Yeah, so my name is Zarie. My pronouns are they, them. And specifically at Victory Programs, I am a peer specialist and I am a community health worker. My peer specialty is other trans and non-binary folk. So a lot of the things that I do for that community is I'm a certified notary in my state. So I notarize a lot of name change papers. I notarize a lot of quarry documents, a lot of housing applications, stuff like that. I help folks through the name change process. So typically that's when I'm helping them through the application, making sure that they get the financial support application all set up as well. And then I'll notarize it because you have to have your name change papers notarized in Massachusetts. And then usually if the person wants me to, I will bring them to the courthouse so they can pass everything in. It's usually a pretty scary experience when you go to the courthouse all alone. You've never been through that process before. So I've found that a lot of people really appreciate when I can be there for them, especially since sometimes you have to wait a really long time in the courthouse line. And then that's when we're waiting for the name change papers to come back. And after that is when I would help folks change their social security card, and then I would help them change their ID. And once they change both of those things, they're able to change anything at that point. I can help them or I cannot. It's really up to them. But my goal is to make sure that they get their new ID and to make sure that they get their new social security card with their name change papers. That's a really big part of what I do right now. And I think I started 2 years ago in August, and I have successfully changed 5 names, which is really awesome for me. A lot of these folks are really happy and I'm happy for them. Other things I do is I do a lot of provider navigation. So if someone needs a primary care doctor, they need a psychiatrist, they need to find a chiropractor or a massage therapist that is trans friendly, I have a pretty long list of safe spaces that folks can go to that the community has deemed safe. A lot of the ways that I would figure that out is I am actually the creator and one of the admins of Trans Exchange Boston. I created it about 4 years ago with some other Black and Brown community members, just because we noticed that there was a lack of trans and non-binary focused spaces even within the community. And we didn't have a Facebook group for that yet to kind of share that knowledge. So I created it with other folks, and a lot of folks share a lot of provider knowledge through there. So that's where I get a lot of that stuff from. I have a really big long doc for it. And then usually once I get an appointment set up, whether that be for a primary care doctor, gender affirming surgery, or it's for hormone stuff, I will go with the person to their intake appointment just so they can find the hospital. At this point, a lot of the intake people at, say, like MGH or Fenway, they know when I'm calling because I call them often. And I have a pretty good knowledge base of what doctors to go to, what surgeons to go to for different types of surgeries. And that really just comes from me reading the reviews, quote unquote, of what other community members have said. So if someone's really looking for a surgeon who is anti-racist, or a surgeon who's not phobic, or a surgeon who does reductions instead of a full top surgery, or does different types of phalloplasties or vaginoplasties. I have figured out how to support people in getting to those doctors that can really support their needs. Just because everyone's gender journey is different and not everybody wants what everybody else wants. And there's specific doctors that can really fit into those different niches of what folks need from their gender reaffirming surgeries and from their hormones. A lot of folks microdose as well, so I like to send them to doctors who know a little bit more about microdosing, about gels, about the packets, about the pills. I just try to make sure that I'm sending them to doctors who are trans competent. That's my biggest thing. Other things that I do is I run trans peer support groups every single week. So I actually have one today. This one is in person. We rotate on a hybrid schedule. So we have in-person groups twice a month, and then we have online groups twice a month. Our online groups are like check-ins and support, and our in-person groups are activities and more communal based, trying to just like do activities, do events, stuff like that. We usually have food, and our age range is pretty wide, honestly, just because we are 18 plus, but we have no age limit. So our age range is from 23 to 74 right now. So we have a really large intergenerational group, and I think that's such an important thing, because something that I found in my state specifically is that there's not a lot of spaces for queer and trans adults that don't revolve around substances, and not everybody wants to be around substances for whatever reason. So this space is a space that is not revolved around substances. It's not like a bar or club or anything. And there's no age limit. So there's a lack of trans adult spaces in Massachusetts. We're really good at supporting young people, but we're not really good at supporting people once they age out of those support groups. But a lot of folks don't know what to do. They lose their community. They don't know how to make friends. They don't know how to move into the workforce, how to get into school, stuff like that. So they lose a pretty big part of just their community and livelihood. And I feel like we need to do a lot better on that in my state. So I'm hoping that I can help alleviate that by co-facilitating these groups every week and supporting other people and starting their own groups. So that's a really big thing that I do as well. And then a lot of my community health stuff is my harm reduction stuff. So in Boston specifically, we're going all around Boston, handing out clean needles, pipes, whether they be straight pipes or the bubbles. We hand out wound care kits. We hand out fentanyl testing strips. We hand out Narcan, so much Narcan. We hand out weather-specific gear. So it's starting to get a lot warmer. So we're handing out a lot of sunscreen and bug spray and electrolyte packets for water bottles. We're also handing out a lot of socks and t-shirts. Also a lot of snacks as well. So my community center in particular, my team, we're a mobile team. So we are walking around Boston, or we're in our van. So our van can obviously hold a lot more. We're usually taking the van to the Massachusetts and Newmarket area, which is where a lot of our clients are currently right now, because there's a lot of programs in that area due to the amount of hospitals and engagement centers that are down there. So we'll go down there with our van, we'll park, and then we'll just spend the next 3 hours handing out harm reduction supplies and trying to get people tested. Inside our van, we have a testing little section. So it has that little medical chair that you can sit in, and we have all of our supplies. So if someone wants to get tested, we try to get them as tested as possible. For folks who are injecting substances, they're at a higher risk of HIV or Hep C because they're bloodborne. So that's usually what we're trying to do when we're down there, is get folks tested for HIV, syphilis, and Hep C. If someone does pop up positive for Hep C, HIV, or syphilis, we have supports for them. In my building, we're right above from the Boston Center, and the Boston Center has been a community center for people living with HIV for longer than I've been alive. So they're a really great community center, and we work with them a lot. And if someone comes up positive for like syphilis or Hep C, we have people on the team who specialize in supporting people in recovering from Hep C, from syphilis. So that's a really cool thing that we do as well. A lot of my team members have their own specialties. So we have a sex worker outreach specialist. We have someone that specializes just in PrEP. We have someone that specializes just in sex education groups. We have someone who specializes just in supporting people in recovering from Hep C and education about Hep C, and they run Hep C groups. And then, of course, I specialize with trans and non-binary people. So we just try to hit every point that we can. So I think it's really great that we have different people on the team with different specialties and different knowledge, just because everybody can't know everything. If I need support on someone, say getting them on PrEP, I'll go to the PrEP person. If someone has a client who needs to get into a sober house and happens to identify as trans, they'll link up with me so we can make sure that we can get them into a trans competent detox, sober home, or a rapid rehousing system, depending on where they want to go.
So, Zarie, you've definitely shared a lot with us so far, and you do 10 million things like I think a lot of people in nonprofits do. So I'm really curious, and I've asked everybody so far, you know, how they've seen the overlap between the work that they do in harm reduction, kind of complement or you know, interplay with queer health, because you talked about being that support for folks who are going and getting a name change or needing to navigate the system and find a provider. But I'm just curious, because I don't know a lot about you know, what goes on, the happenings in Massachusetts or in Boston, but in your opinion, like what are you seeing as kind of that overlap between those two aspects?
Right. So a lot of things that I have learned about the intersection between drug use in the LGBT community is that there's a big prevalence of folks using crack or crack cocaine. So that's where I see a lot of folks coming in, is that if someone is LGBT, usually that is their substance of choice. It has been a substance in the community for a really long time, particularly in Boston, is what I have been learning. So that's usually where I'm supporting people the most, is making sure that they have harm reduction tools to alleviate or lessen the harm that can happen if you are using those substances, because there is no using substances without any risk. My goal is to make sure that I lessen the risk. Other things that I'm finding is that a lot of folks who are deciding that they want to go through detox, or if they want to go through recovery, is that they want to make sure that they're in a space that's trans competent and will respect their identity. A lot of folks are on hormones, and that involves using needles sometimes, or taking pills or taking gels. And a lot of folks are always concerned that they're not going to be able to take their medication while they're in a sober home or in a detox, because usually if someone has a pill or if someone has a needle, people are going to associate that with non-legal, quote unquote, drug use instead of their testosterone or their estrogen or their anti-testosterone blockers. So usually I'm doing a lot of research on where folks can go where that will not be a hindrance to them. They will still be able to take their medication and recover from those substances that they don't want to take anymore. A lot of our recovery homes in Massachusetts are very cisgender male centered, just because that's where most of our research is going into. It's not necessarily going into cisgender women or LGBT people or into people of color. The primary, what I'm seeing is that most of our data is coming from cisgender white men. So my hope is to do more research into places that are safer for non-cisgender white men, just because those are identities that I hold, those are identities that a lot of my community members hold. And I feel like if someone's ready to go through detox, someone wants a peer support group, someone wants harm reduction supplies, someone wants to go to a recovery home, that their identities are respected, because it's going to be important to them. There's one LGBT sober home in Massachusetts. I believe it is in Salem, but I do not particularly remember where it is. I just know it's the only one in Massachusetts currently, as of right now. There's only one sober home that is LGBT centered. I can't say that all the other recovery homes aren't LGBT competent, just because I haven't been to every single one. But the ones particularly in my program is that we have a couple of houses that has had trans people in there, and they've seemed to have a, I wouldn't say good time. I would say it was affirming. Of course, there's going to be people who are a little bit confused. They don't really understand what's going on. There has to be some education in those groups. And that's where I would come in to make sure that the person's getting the support that they need in their house. And I also run an LGBT 101 group, so other members in the house can understand that there is going to be queer and trans people coming through the recovery home, because they need to recover just like y'all. A lot of these folks don't necessarily have the education to know about the community, so I'm just here to support them in getting that education. not everybody is coming at my clients with ill intent. They're just confused. They don't understand what a pronoun is. They don't understand the nuances of gender identity. They don't understand the nuances of sexuality, because sometimes when you're a cisgender straight person, you've never really had to think about that before. So that's my opportunity to come and chat with them about it. And a lot of the homes have been really receptive towards that. And my goal is just to make sure that my recovery homes and my program are a little more safer for queer and trans people to go to. And that it also opens up the door for people to be able to think a little bit more about their sexuality and gender, no matter where they fall on the spectrum. Because sometimes, like I said, they didn't get the opportunity to think about that until now. It opens up a lot of doors for people, even if they are cisgender, even if they are straight. They get to think about the nuances of their sexuality and their gender and what it means to them.
Absolutely. You bring up a lot of good points. One of the things that you said earlier was, harm reduction practices needing to incorporate HRT supplies, or, and that's like a big thing for me too, like having worked in SSP in the past and trying to fight to get those supplies. Is that something that your organization does, or do you have to refer out, or what do you usually do if someone comes in there looking, for like something for an IM injection, looking for an 18 gauge or a 23 or something for a sub-Q? How does that go?
Yeah, so we actually do have needles for people who are taking hormones. We have multiple shelves you can see behind me. These are a lot of our needles because we just don't have space in our main area. So we've just started getting shelves so we can put it around us. So somewhere in these boxes, there's needles specifically for people who are injecting hormones. So if someone needs them, they can get them from us. And then we also have the alcohol wipes. We have syringe containers once they've been used. We have Band-Aids. We have everything someone needs to make sure that they can take their injection and take it safely. And we also take used needles and we dispose of them for people. That's something that's really hard for anyone who's injecting anything, is where do I put my needles after it's done? And I'm finding that this is something that's affecting LGBTQ people a lot, because sometimes if you ask an exchange group, where can I bring used needles that I use for my medication? A lot of people will say a police station. And that's just not where most people who are LGBT, or if they're LGBT and they're BIPOC, they're not going to bring a whole milk jug full of used hormone needles to a police station. So that's something that I'm outsourcing a lot, is letting people know that whatever they use those needles for, I'm not really judging you for it, but if you need to dispose of them, you can dispose of them here. Every single month, we have this huge box full of used needles, and a biohazard box thing get taken by Stericycle. And yeah, that's usually just what I'm outsourcing to people, is just bring them here. That's something that a lot of people aren't told about when they start hormones, is where to bring their used needles after. And then someone's been on hormones for a year or two, and they have juice bottles or milk jugs or 6 of those red containers, and they're like, here you go. And I'm just like, thank you.
Yeah, it's like the untold story, right? I remember when I started hormones, it was great, here's all the stuff, go forth with it. And I'm just putting a bunch of needles into a protein powder thing, because it was huge. It's the biggest thing I could find. And it's at a certain point, what do you do? And I remember calling, and I think I called the town I was living at the time. They're like, tape it up, put biohazard on it, and throw it in the trash. And I'm like, because I didn't want to go, like you're saying, I didn't want to go to the cops and then be like, why are you giving us needles? And you know what I mean? And I'm saying that as a white trans mask person, you know what I mean? So I can't even imagine, to your credit, having, other intersecting identities on top of that, right? If someone's a sex worker, someone's well-known in the community, and they're already being heavily policed, that's not a conversation people want to have, nor should they be put in that situation. So I love that you're doing that, because I know some programs struggle with it. They're like, well, we have to pay for all this, right? We have to pay for the Stericycle to come and it be incinerated, but that's part of harm reduction, right? It's not only handing it out.
That's what I was literally just about to say. That is part of harm reduction, because it puts an end to people reusing needles, because not only can we take the needles that you just used, we can give you new ones after you're done with them. So you don't have to reuse anything because you feel like you have to, because you don't know where to get new ones and you don't know where to put your old ones. But yeah, most commonly people are like, go to the police station. And I'm like, that's not accessible to like anyone.
It's not accessible at all. And I remember when we had our initial conversation, you were telling me some really, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but interesting stuff about how Boston is kind of like cut up or delineated, right? Like you were talking about Newmarket and how a lot of folks are pushed into that area, and that there's like a high density of maybe, I don't know if it's methadone clinics or drop-in centers in that one location. And how, I think I was telling you too, right? Like last time I was in Boston at the end of 2021, I did not see a single homeless person, and it alarmed me because I'm like, there's no way. It's a large city, right? Like you go to New York City, you see houseless people everywhere, left and right. There's so much poverty. It's so much worse now. It's incredibly exacerbated. And you were saying like, yeah, that's because they're pushing people out into these very kind of niche areas and saying like, well, that's not our problem, basically.
Yeah.
So
it doesn't matter if you're using substances or not. If you are homeless, that is the area you are pushed into. And that's not safe for anybody. And it's really counterinductive because people started setting up tents in the areas that they were being pushed into, and then their tents got taken. So my brain was just like, you want people to be in this area, but you don't want them to have shelter. I'm confused.
Well, because it's not about protecting people. We know that, and we see that everywhere, right? When they do that, right? If it was about protecting people, all these things, like we wouldn't have jobs, maybe, right? You know, like we always say, like we're trying to work ourselves out of jobs, right? Like we're doing stuff. Our jobs are basically to fill in all the blanks where there have been policy failures and rampant policy failures since like the dawn of time, right? Like essentially, if you want to cut it up, like that's what it is, you know? So it's just, it's infuriating. So I think one of the next things that you were talking about is doing some trainings, and you know, you were talking about in the homes, like doing those LGBTQ 101. So is that part of your job as well? Like if some organization, local organization or whoever is like, hey, we want to, you know, have like an LGBT 101 or like a trans 101, or is that a request that you take on? And if so, like, have you seen an increase in requests like that?
So I do those types of workshops within my job, and I also do them outside of my job. I freelance, so I'm a public speaker and a workshop creator, and I have quite a few of my own that a lot of people have requested. So I do a lot of LGBT. I have LGBT 101s and trans 101s, and then I have my 2.0 ones, which I take it a step up. And a lot of those are just like humanizing queer and trans identities, because I believe that like everybody knows that queer and trans people exist. Now we have to humanize the reality that folks are living in and the community and the history, the highs and the lows. So I do have my 101s, and then I just have my ones that are a step above that, where it's just humanizing the existence of our community. A lot of other things is I do a lot of sex education workshops. I do those within the programs, and then I do those on my own outside of work. A lot of those are risk reduction, consent and boundaries, external and internal condoms, where to find those, how to put those on. I talk a lot about not using flavored condoms if you're having intercourse with somebody who has a vagina, because they can get a yeast infection. I talk a lot about how to initiate, how to give consent, how to take it away, how to figure out when someone is taking away consent, stuff like that, because that's something that I find that a lot of people outside of the recovery homes that I do workshops in and inside of the recovery homes that I do workshops in, is a lot of people don't realize is that they have experienced some type of coercion or assault because they didn't realize that that was coercion or assault, because no one ever really taught them. Especially if you're in an AFAB body, you're expected to just give. So a lot of my workshops are trying to give people back like their autonomy and their safety in their own bodies and how they can do that, and that they don't have to give something to somebody just because that's what society expects of them. I also talk a lot about the pleasure of AFAB bodies because I find even in the queer community, when we're talking about sex education, we're very focused on cisgender men having sex with cisgender men. And my goal is to bridge that gap and to make sure that everybody, no matter who they're having sex with, what their genitals look like, what their gender identity is that they have the same access to sex education, HIV and STI testing, and PrEP as cisgender men do. So that's something that I'm doing in the recovery homes and outside of the recovery homes.
My gosh, that's so much work. I'm like, literally, you're like the whole package when we talk about wraparound services, right? So
I try my best.
Yeah, like literally, but I think that speaks to how dynamic the needs are of the queer community, and that a lot of organizations, and this is not throwing shade at anybody specifically, that we're not doing a good enough job of meeting those expectations and meeting those needs. Because I think I told you when I first started this, the program, Lighthouse Learning Collective, the program that I run, it was really born out of this idea that, you know, harm reduction agencies, better for worse, they're not great at addressing the needs of queer folks. And then conversely, queer folks are not great talking about substance use and, you know, not maybe well-versed or comfortable talking about harm reduction supplies or what that really means. Because even though harm reduction has been around for a while, I'm biased, right? I literally work for an organization called National Harm Reduction Coalition. But doing a lot of these trainings with queer providers, it's very easy to see how even though you can have staff with lived experience, you can have staff that's educated, but I think a lot of the issue too lies with the way that these things are being talked about in academic institutions. Like if you're looking for a therapist or you're looking for, you know, substance use counselor, they're using very specific like abstinence geared language to talk about things. So I'm not putting a blanket on everybody, but there's always this fear, right? That like, oh, we're telling people it's okay to use. And it's like, that's missing the whole point, right? It's really meeting that person where they are, but you're not leaving them there. You're saying like, all right, I know you're doing this stuff and thank you so much for sharing that with me, but how can we make sure you're, you know, still going to be alive, or you can make it another day, or you're not going to get sick, or you can get tested if you need to. It's just so many different layers to it. And the more you talk about it, I'm like, wow, I'm like, Zarie's hitting all these different factors. And I just wish, right, that more folks could see that someone who's a community health worker, a peer support specialist, has the ability, has the capacity to do these very nuanced things, right? Because like we have community health workers in my state in Connecticut where I live, we have them in Massachusetts where you are, but there's not often like a specialty or designation given to like working in queer spaces, right? Like substance use or mental health or physical health, you know, overall health, primary care is something. But a lot of the work you're doing reminds me of what I got my start doing as a community health worker. And that opened my eyes to say like, we're doing this all wrong. And I'm in a very resource state as you are as well, right? Like we talked about this last time, is you have a ton of hospitals in the area, you have Fenway there, but I think there's a misconception, because I even see that doing trainings in the city where you have places like Callan Lord, that just because you have these health centers doesn't mean that everybody is going to be 100%, 110%, 200% all on the same page and knowing how to address those needs. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, where do you see this going? Like, what does the future of your work look like? What's your passion project or passion projects? Because you sound incredibly busy.
Yeah, I am busy. Sometimes someone will be like, what's your week look like? And I'll explain what my week looks like. And someone's like, do you sleep? And I'm like, of course I do, just not as much as I should. Yeah, I guess my hope for the future is that I'm seeing more resources and more community centers and more providers really focusing on BIPOC and LGBT people. The reality is people who are marketing like cigarettes or alcohol, et cetera, and so on. Their primary targets are my communities, because in the world that we live in, there's so much stress put on our shoulders, so much sorrow put on our shoulders, and so much anger put on our shoulders just by the way the world treats us, just for how we look, how we identify, and oftentimes or not, that can lead someone to using substances. And these substances companies know that, and they're marketing off our trauma. And I don't really judge anyone for getting into substances because of the stuff that they experience. My literal only goal is to make sure that they can get the care that they need the way that they want to, and that their whole self is seen. That's something that I find in a lot of community centers, is that a lot of people leave some of their identities behind because they feel like they can't bring their full self. And that's just not how I operate. I want someone to bring their full self to the table, because bringing their full self to the table is going to get them where they want to be. They're not going to get everything addressed or supported in the way that they want if they had to hide something from me. So my goal is just to make sure that someone can bring their full self to the table, because that's what I needed in a lot of spaces. And if I was to give an example, sometimes I would go into an LGBT space and I felt like I couldn't talk about being a person of color. If I went into a BIPOC space, I feel like I couldn't talk about being queer or being trans. So that's the goal. Someone can bring in their entire selves. And I talk a lot about preemptive radical inclusion. And what that is and what that means to me is that if I can help some of the most marginalized identities, like if I make a space that supports the most marginalized identities, everybody else will be taken care of. So that's another goal of mine, is to make sure that I am taking care of the most marginalized identities. Everyone else will be fine if I can do that.
Yeah, and I think that feeds beautifully into like what we talk a lot about in Lighthouse is without queer liberation, right? Or the liberation of Black, queer, trans bodies, like there's going to be liberation for none of us, right? So it's nothing for us without us. And you're speaking to that, you know, because a lot of people think it's a zero-sum game, right? They're like, well, if my identity is not the one being talked about the most, or this and that, and all the focus is being shifted towards this group of people, I'm going to get nothing out of this, and it's not for me. But what people don't realize is we've been talking about the same people for such a long time, right? And I think that people tend to cloak their sense of like wokeness in the queer community and saying like, well, I'm trans and I can't cause any harm to anyone, without like, it's reductive, it's not intersectional. And I love what you're bringing in, and it's so needed that you're having spaces that really layer this, right? Like when you're talking about you're going into a BIPOC space, you're like, I don't really feel comfortable saying that I'm queer. If you're going to a queer space, you're like, I don't want to be the only person of color in the room. And then like it gets weird and I get tokenized and I just feel all sorts of uncomfortable and have to deal with all this BS. So that's really, I think, what the crux of this movement is and where it needs to go, is that even doing this project, right? And that was one thing that I had put in when I was looking for nominations, is saying like, you know, I want Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, queer folks like at the front. Like we need to tell those stories. But I think the other part of it is too, is I needed to be realistic and say like, do these folks even have the capacity, or are they going to know, or how is the word going to get out? Or like, do we have enough folks of color like in these positions, right? Like the light bulb went on and it's kind of like, where are our folks? Like, are we able to, like a lot of the folks I know that fit all of those qualifiers and all that criteria, they're doing 10 million jobs because their one job working in a nonprofit, they don't make enough money. And that's the reality of it. Like these jobs are not really well paid. And two, it's also kind of traumatic in a way, right? Because you're having to like deal with very personal things on a daily basis, and you're having to be that advocate for your community because other folks are not doing it, right?
Yeah. I am doing 10 million things all the time. A lot of these things bring me joy, but I realized very quickly when I started doing all of them is I burnt out real fast, because the tokenization did happen and then the underpayment did happen. And I had to do a lot of work to build up not only my self-care regimes, to make sure that I was really taking care of myself. And that includes stuff like video games, buying clothes if I wanted them, if I had all my bills paid, my skincare routine. And then one thing I really had to learn and recently was taking my days off when I have them, and not just being like, well, I just have to come. Like, I don't need a day off. I need a day off. And making sure that I'm taking those days off. Yeah, just making sure that I'm taking care of myself and making sure that I am showing my worthiness to other people. I do not lowball myself anymore. If I'm doing like a workshop outside of work or something like that, I tell people my expectations on what I should be compensated for. I have a sliding scale, mostly because I want to be knowledgeable that some people are asking for these workshops and they don't have a lot. But also, I'm not going to do a 3-hour workshop on LGBT identity for $100. So we have to find a middle ground. I want you to get the education that you need, and I also need to get paid because I have bills to pay. And I live in Boston, which is we're dealing with a pretty big housing crisis right now. We're in the top 5 most expensive cities to live in. And a lot of the people who have lived there their whole lives are being pushed out by people who are outside of Massachusetts, people who make a lot of money, people who are buying up housing for Airbnbs, and honestly, a lot of greedy landlords. I grew up in Dorchester, and that is predominantly a Black and brown neighborhood. And going back to my old neighborhood, it just doesn't look the same anymore. Right now, I live in a predominantly Black and brown area in Jamaica Plain. And a lot of those areas, like if you take a bus and then go maybe like 6 or 7 stops, you're seeing like friggin' mansions, which is really weird when you just left a very mom and pop shop, community oriented Black and brown neighborhood that's focused on just like surviving in that area. So that's just, yeah, I do not lowball myself because 1, I need to survive. 2, I know my worth. And 3, I have a cat to take care of and I know her worth and she deserves only the best food. And the best
yeah, I love that. Cats are expensive, but also not funny is what you said about Boston being in the top 5 because it is wildly out of control. I mean, I know across the nation, right, COVID only exacerbated the growing, mounting housing crisis, and I'm sure you've seen it in the streets too, with like those encampments building up or just having more folks that maybe you didn't see, or, you have more participants, more clients, there's less access, and everyone's being squeezed. And at a certain point, like, where are people going to go, right? You cannot move people out of their communities. There's quite literally nowhere for people to go. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but something at the end of the day has got to give, right? Things are only worsening.
You need rent control.
Rent control, hell yeah, because all the freezes are off now, right? So it's just all hell's breaking loose. Like they always talk about in New York, like Chelsea's rent went up like, I don't know, what was it, like 20% or so? Ridiculous, like $6,000 for a 3-bedroom apartment or something. It's just like, I don't know who's going to be able to live there, stay there.
I was to give an example of kind of like how Boston rent is right now. Before the pandemic, a 3-bedroom apartment in Jamaica Plain would maybe be $2,600 to $2,750, right? And now I'm seeing a lot of 3-bedroom apartments being $3,000, $3,100, $3,000, $2,000, and that's how much 4 to 5 bedrooms used to cost before the pandemic. And now those 4 to 5 bedrooms are going up to the 4,000s, 4,100, stuff like that. And this is something that I'm seeing in the queer housing community, is a lot of people are struggling to find places to go. The homelessness has ticked up in the community. People are sharing bedrooms. People are living with 5, 6, 7 other people. A lot of people are relying on, I wouldn't say relying, a lot of people are seeking out support from community centers who don't have enough money to give to the people who are trying to pay broker fees, the first and last, the security deposit, because those have shot up as well. So a lot of people are just struggling to even pay the initial fee.
Oh my gosh.
It's rough.
That is rough. And then on top of COVID, right? When you have like 5 or 6 people in one space, and they're like, make sure you're wearing masks, make sure you can't. It's just not, it's inevitable, right? And it's placing that undue burden of illness on, poor people, right? On Black people, on brown people, on queer people. I mean, it doesn't end.
Really. A lot of us are working multiple jobs.
Yeah.
And going to school.
Right. Oh my gosh.
Community aid is something that has helped so many people survive. And community aid looks like a lot of different things. A lot of community fridges and pantries have popped up in Boston. And those are usually plugged into local community centers, shops, restaurants, stuff like that. So people can get food when they need to. There's one in Jamaica Plain, and that can be filled up to the max. And then within an hour or two, it's empty again. Same thing in Dorchester, same thing in Roxbury. There's one in Chelsea. There's one on Mass Ave. There's one in Brighton. There's one in Alston. And they empty as quick as they fill up. A lot of people, a lot of exchange groups is like exchanging of furniture, clothes. A lot of things that I'm seeing right now is baby formula. There's not enough formula, which was really scary. So like community aid groups, whether that be financial, material, and that comes in food, furniture, clothes, etc., is really vital to the survival of these communities, because the government's not doing what it's supposed to make sure that people can really thrive.
Absolutely.
Like the Trans Emergency Fund has helped so many people avoid homelessness, pay for surgeries, stuff like that. And it's a nonprofit. It's a really small team. The team is incredible. I love them so much. They're such stars and just substantially amazing people in the community, but there's just not enough to go around. So it's really, really tough sometimes.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. And I know we're pretty much out of time and I want to let you go, but I feel like that's a good note to end on, because I think it brings up what harm reduction has really been born out of: the community, right? The community response to the lack of,
resources.
The true government intervention, like what was going on with ACT UP and HIV and AIDS in the 80s, and like people really not caring and not giving a shit. And even now we're seeing the same thing with like the overdose crisis. Over 108,000 people gone. Like, how many more lives have to be lost and ruined and just people cast aside for people to start caring and not placing the burden again on the community as a whole, a community that already is struggling, like you said, to get resources. It's a lot, but I commend you. Your work is invaluable. I mean, I hope that people recognize that. I mean, you got nominated, so somebody is recognizing.
Yeah. Which I'm still so shocked about, but then my friends keep telling me, stop saying that, you do so much. And I'm just like, I'm just really bad at like recognizing my own achievements. I need to do better at that.
Oh yeah, well that's part of self-care, right? Like we were talking about earlier, it's part of self-care. Yes. So with that, Zarie, I thank you. And I know this is not the last time that we'll be conversing. Definitely stay in touch. You know where I am with LLC and all that good stuff. So yeah, just thank you so much.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I really appreciated talking about all of these things. It's important to me. And like I said, without community, things would be really tough. So I credit just the where I am to my community, and a lot of other people wouldn't have been where they are without community and just love.
I love that.